Now we're ready to go.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call the meeting of the Mendocino County Planning Commission on April 1st to order at 9:02 a.m. Effective March 27th, 2020, the Mendocino County Planning Commission meetings will be conducted virtually and not available for in-person public participation. Meetings are live streamed and available for viewing on the Mendocino County YouTube page at www.youtube.com/Mendocino County Video. In order to minimize the risk of exposure during this time of emergency, the public may participate digitally in meetings by sending comments to pbscommissions@mendocinocounty.org in lieu of personal attendance. All public comment will be made immediately available to the commissioners, staff, and the general public as they are received and processed by staff and can be viewed as attachments to this meeting agenda at the Planning Commission agenda page. Requests for telecomment are required to be submitted prior to 7 a.m. the morning of the meeting. If you requested to speak under public expression, please call in now. Okay, roll call.
Commissioner Wiedemann.
Here.
Commissioner Pollan. Here. Commissioner Jones.
Here.
And Chair Purnell.
Here.
Thank you.
So to clarify, we still do not have our 5th commissioner, is that correct?
She's been appointed. I'm waiting for an oath of office to be filed, and then she can join the meetings.
Thank you for that update. Okay, do we have a determination of legal notice?
Legal notice has been determined by mailing the agenda to the commission.
Wonderful. And a director's report.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission, Nash Gonzalez, Planning and Building Services Director. Very quickly, I think Jim touched upon this, but yes, our 5th commissioner has been appointed by the board. That's Macy Morse. And as Jim pointed out, still needs to take the oath of office before being able to join us, and we anticipate that'll happen very soon. So my next item is, I had mentioned several weeks ago that the department was in the process of wrapping up the safety element. The safety element right now is in the hands of CAL FIRE, and we have tentatively scheduled this item for the April 15th Planning Commission meeting. And so it has been scheduled, and notice is going out. But again, the only thing that will change there, where we may have to postpone it, would be if CAL FIRE does not get back to us in time. We anticipate we should have their comments back tomorrow, but again, that's what was noted. But I'll see it, or I'll confirm it once those comments are in. Once the comments come in, if there's any changes that need to be made, we'll make those, and we can then move forward. And then we'll basically have a safety element that'll be, in the words of CAL FIRE, compliant. And basically what the commission has to do is hear the item and make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. So again, we've tentatively scheduled that for April 15th. And with that, that'll conclude the director's report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the commission?
I have one.
Commissioner Wiedemann?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Is there anything else on the April 15th calendar right now coming? Nash?
Jim, do we have anything scheduled?
I have nothing else scheduled that day, just the safety element.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you for that director's report.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, and moving on to item number 4, matters from the public. The Planning Commission welcomes participation in commission meetings. This item is limited to matters under the jurisdiction of the commission that are not on the posted agenda and items which have not already been considered by the commission. No action will be taken. Individuals wishing to address the commission under public expression are welcome to do so via telecomment or email in lieu of personal attendance. Emails shall be sent to pbscommissions@mendocinocounty.org. All correspondence received will be made available on the Planning Commission agenda page. To submit public comments via telecomment, a request form must have been received by 7 a.m. the morning of the meeting. Do we have any matters from the public this morning?
I did not receive any telecomments or any correspondence.
Thank you. Moving on to the consent calendar, of which there is none, which puts us on our regular calendar. Item 6A, review and update of the Planning Commission bylaws and rules of procedure. And I'm guessing we're turning it over to staff on this one.
Oh, this is Nash Gonzalez. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. This is Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. We are bringing this item forward today in part because today is the first meeting with the new composition of the board of the Planning Commission. The board's ordinance changing the composition of the commission to 5 members is in effect. And that means some certain changes to the bylaws are necessary at this time. And there's a red line of the bylaws posted to the webpage. And in multiple places throughout that document, there have been reference to votes of 4 of the members of the commission. And at this point, given that was in all likelihood because it was talking about 4 members of 7 for a majority vote, we've proposed changes to strike that language and replace it in most cases with a majority of the commission. So I'm happy to walk through the red line that was posted. On page 1, section 3, this was the first place where there was a reference to 4 affirmative votes. That's been changed to a majority votes of a majority of the commission. On the next page, section 6, is where the largest changes are being proposed to the bylaws. Striking everything that had been there before, updated language would be that a majority of the members of the commission shall constitute a quorum for the transaction of business. An affirmative vote of a majority of the membership of the commission shall be required to take action on items which require a report and recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, including general plan amendments, zoning code amendments, and rezonings of real property. So for the commission's information, the government code specifically requires a majority of the commission to take action together on any recommendations regarding general plan amendments. It does not contain that same language for rezonings. However, in consultation with the department, the staff would like to keep those recommendations also at a majority of the commission, which would be a minimum of 3 votes. The next sentence is probably the largest change being proposed, and that is for all other items, including procedural motions, an affirmative vote of a majority of the quorum shall be required for action. And there, the all other items is referring specifically to an action like where the commission has jurisdiction, say a use permit. And there, the proposed language would enable action to be taken by a majority of the quorum, not necessarily a majority of the commission. Going backwards in time, there have been issues in terms of numbers of 7. Here, this technically would enable an approval on a 2-1 vote of the commission if only 3 members were present. And I see a hand is raised, Commissioner Pollan.
Thank you, Mr. Kudrowski. I just want to clarify and make sure that I'm hearing this correctly, and I think that I am, that like at not our last meeting, but the meeting before, an item came before the commission and we didn't have a sufficient vote, and so it passed. The tower up in Laytonville, it passed because we weren't able to take action in a timely enough manner. This change to the bylaws would allow, if we had a quorum at a meeting, we could conduct that type of a hearing and make a determination if only 2 of the 3 commissioners were voting in the affirmative. Is that correct?
Through the chair, Commissioner Pollan, that it is more correct. There are usually a multitude of issues that have happened in the past with planning commissions, and part of that will be addressed in the training to follow in regards to what happens when certain commissioners may have a conflict of interest in terms of how that reduces the number who are able to count towards quorum. But yes, in terms of a situation where only 3 members of the commission are available that is a quorum, this would say a vote of 2 of those 3 would enable a final action on a use permit.
So do we lose a quorum if we have a commissioner that has to recuse themselves and we drop below the 3-person threshold?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski. I'll let Counsel Curtis address it in a bit more detail in the next training, but the basics of it would be there are certain rules regarding required participation. That being said, if we're dropping below 3 only because of an absence, I believe it is the case that really an absent person would not enable the use of the legally required participation. It has to be actually a vacant seat. That's something we can explain in a little more detail later on.
Okay, thank you.
So Chair Purnell, I see that Commissioner Jones has a hand up.
Yes, Commissioner Jones.
Thank you, Chair Parnell. I just have a follow-up question on what Commissioner Paulin asked. And I know in past practices where I dealt with boards and commissions, if there was a majority, in other words, if 2 or 3 people had a conflict with an action and the commission was unable to take a vote because of that conflict, essentially the Brown Act allows all the conflicts to be abated and everybody to participate. And I don't know if that needs to be in the bylaws, but I think it is something that maybe you or the other legal counsel could clarify for us. And if not today, maybe at a future date, because that's certainly what we did. And so I sure hope it was legal. Anyway, that was my comment.
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I'll let Mr. Curtis step in now or later if need be. I don't know that it's necessarily the case that all conflicts are abated, but conflicts, there's, I think, even down to a drawing of straws in certain situations. Christian, you want to address that now or later?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm happy to address that in the next item on the ethics training if the and conflicts if the Planning Commission would prefer, or I can speak a little bit to that now, whatever the chair's preference is.
Could you speak to that now?
Certainly. So Christian Curtis, County Counsel. So there's a few different situations in which there are different rules that might apply. So there are different types of conflicts. The one that we deal with the most commonly is going to be a conflict of interest under the Political Reform Act, which is generally a financial conflict that's somehow indistinguishable from, or this is somehow distinguishable from the public interest generally. Common scenarios would be you own property that's within a certain proximity to the proposed project. What Mr. Kudrowski is referring to is what's called the rule of necessity. Essentially, the statute has been interpreted in a way that if it would completely paralyze the government entity, there has to essentially be an exception to the conflict. That doesn't mean that it may be everyone participating. It may be that it's only the minimum number that are needed to get to a vote. And there are some sort of specific rules and guidance that will come into play when those situations pop up. I will say, quite frankly, I'm not going to remember all of the processes in advance. What we like to do is, if we think that situation is coming up, we research it, we make sure that we're ready, and we can tell you exactly what needs to happen. Mr. Kudrowski is correct. There may be a random process for selection in certain instances in which you have the rule of necessity applying that requires participation of one of multiple members. That being said, there are other types of conflicts of interest out there. There may, for example, be when you're acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, if there are things that would prevent you from being an appropriate person to be hearing the matter, either due to a financial conflict or, a lot of the case law involves a situation in which someone had been, say, an advocate for or against a project, outside of their role in the commission. recusal may be appropriate in those cases to preserve the integrity of the record. And those will be following slightly different rules.
Great, thank you for that. And were there some more red lines to review?
Deputy County Council Matthew Kudrowski. So that's the meat of it. Beyond that, there's a couple of cleanup changes as well. And going to section 7, that was just a cleanup recommended change to just note that there are a handful of noticing procedures for special meetings in the Brown Act specifically. So I wanted to clarify that there. On section 10 on page 3, these are also both cleanup changes. I believe that this was generally taken from the board's rules of procedures. So there was one reference to the board that still had left there, and Appendix B, I believe, is specifically regarding an attachment to those rules of procedure. So that was removed as well. Going to the rules of procedure, it looks like a handful of just pure formatting changes in Rule 1 were added. Separate from that, in Rule 6, this I've updated the fraction here to reflect 4/5 as opposed to 2/3. Oh, sorry, I see a hand up.
Commissioner Pollan, you're muted.
Thank you. Have these been adopted, or are we open to any suggestions on anything in what's in here we're seeing before us today?
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, these are for the commission's consideration today. I think if I were to advise the commission on actions for the moment, I might say or ask the commission adopt certainly the changes that get us out of the 4-vote requirement moving forward, because in future meetings we'll have a 5-member commission. So we can certainly adopt some changes today. And I was actually going to invite the commission to review these after today's meeting. And we can bring an item back in the future for consideration on additional changes and discussion. I'm aware the commission members may not have thought too hard about the bylaws in the past. And so I don't think we need to take all actions today. We can bring these back before the commission in the future.
Okay, thank you. There was just one small suggestion in the rules of procedure that I'd like to suggest for the commission's consideration. I don't know if now is the time to do that, or if we're going to do that later through written submissions.
My suggestion is let's hear the rest of County Council's suggested changes via the red line, and then we can open it up to commission discussion.
Great, thank you.
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, looking at, so Rule 6, I modified that to be a 4/5 vote to match. A 2/3 vote of the commission is generally means a 4/5 vote. And in other places, I did leave it at 2/3. The Brown Act specifically leaves it at 2/3. I was just going to leave it there as well. In Rule 7, that deletion is specifically targeted at a rule that is, I believe, from the board's rules, and here would be contradictory to the change that we're making above in terms of allowing less than a majority on certain items within the commission's jurisdiction. In Rule 8, I deleted the italicized language recommended, mainly because off-agenda items are also addressed in the bylaws as opposed to the rules, and also in the Brown Act. I thought it was getting duplicative to have it here as well as the bylaws. And that would be the total changes in terms of the immediate issues. Certain cleanup things that I saw, but mainly the issues of the requirement for 4 members of the commission to vote on an item. If there's any questions, please let me know.
Commissioner Wiedemann.
Yes, going back to Rule 6. So we're changing from 2/3 to 4/5 on Rule 6, and And my question is, why would we keep that 4/5 and have so many other things 2/3? Like, in other words, 3 votes. I get that 3 votes out of a 5 board, it can be a majority. Okay, so the question I have is on number 6, it changes to 4/5. So that means, would we need 4 votes out of 5? That's how I read that. Is that correct, Matthew?
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, yes, that's 4 votes out of 5. I believe I made that change. I think that if I'm correct in my memory, it was the board's rules of procedures also moved it, had it stated as 4/5, and that's because a 2/3 vote in a 5-member body essentially rounds up, because either a 3/5 vote is 60%, and a 2/3 vote requires 66% or better. That would essentially mean 4/5. I'm more than happy to strike that change. Out for that on that item, I was looking to try and simplify it because of that issue with how of the fractional numbers separately, and then leave the rest of the Brown Act level of 2/3. That was all I was looking for.
Is there a reason why that can't simply state a majority of the commission? Because here it's reading like a supermajority is required, and I'm wondering why there would be a more stringent rule for questions laid over by request.
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I can't explain why it was 2/3 as opposed to a majority previously. That's just where it was for the moment. If we just want to leave it at 2/3, and this is one of those things where I think we could have, there's multiple areas of the bylaws and rules that could be reviewed in a longer meeting or a separate item for the commission. This kind of came forward essentially only because of the provisions with 4 votes on that in there. So we can undo that recommended change very easily and discuss further.
And thank you for that. And I'm wondering if you could maybe give us some examples about the types of items that would be covered under Rule 6, because that might help inform what type of vote we'll be looking for on that.
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I'll have to look a little more at Rule 6, to be honest, to try and sort out where that might pop up. I'm not sure I see a lot of these rules ever come into play. I also see that Commissioner Jones has her hand up.
Great, thanks for letting us put you on the spot. Commissioner Jones, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. That one also rang out for me. And then back in the bylaws on section 9, I know you didn't make changes to the sentence, but it doesn't read for me. Like, I don't understand what it says. So I'm wondering if maybe at some point something was deleted and it just was never caught until now.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I can't say if anything was deleted in past versions from that. I read that as the minutes of meetings are considered to the end or to the purpose that any corrections, alterations, or additions may be made by the commission. So
it's legal speak. I get it. It didn't read for me, so I appreciate that clarification. So I think those are the only questions I have. And I guess I have one sort of like procedural question. I just don't understand what it means. Like, I don't understand what it means to lay something on the table or to do something called the previous question. So just for my own information, it would be nice to know what those actually refer to. That's on page 2 of the rules of procedure.
So Deputy County Counsel Matthew Kudrowski, I will acknowledge that I think a lot of the rules here are looking to fairly, I don't want to use the word arcane, but older language that you see in the Robert's Rules of Order. And to go through and specify, and this is I think what I was alluding to earlier in responding to a question, I think there's language here that probably could be modernized. And I think a lot of that doesn't necessarily get used by commissions or boards very often. So again, for the moment, I'd have to have a further discussion and go back to additional rules and books to try to be able to go through each item in these rules to discuss what those mean by the board. I'm aware there are updated versions of rules that can be relied upon as well. Roberts is just kind of a basic, and I find Roberts at times to be a little difficult. So if, for a longer discussion on those items, I think I might say, defer those to a different day. The primary concern being if there aren't certain changes made to the bylaws, then the bylaws would still require a vote of 4 members of the commission to move on certain items. And that, I think, is the clearest potential issue at the moment.
Great, thank you, Mr. Kudrowski. And I would like to bring forward a procedural point. It looks like we've been joined by Commissioner Macy Morse. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm sorry, I apologize for being late. So I'm just kind of sitting and learning. So thank you.
Great. And are you here in official capacity as a sworn-in commissioner today?
I am. I was sworn in yesterday, so yes.
Okay, well, welcome to the commission. And County Council, would it be appropriate for us to give our new commissioner an opportunity to introduce herself?
Yes, I believe that would be quite appropriate.
Wonderful, thank you. Please, let us get to know you.
Hi, I'm Macy Morse. I'm a local defense attorney in town. I am born and raised in Ukiah for 49 years now. And so I'm very familiar with Mendocino County, and I am honored and privileged that Mo asked me to be on the commission. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I am looking forward to learning. And so I own a house here. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and I'm just kind of a single mom, you know, a 21-year-old. So that's me in a nutshell. I took over Catherine Elliott's practice when she became county council. And so that's where I'm at. I'm in her old office on State Street, and I basically dabble in criminal defense and juvenile work. So thanks.
Wonderful, and welcome, Commissioner Morse.
Thank you.
Okay. County Council, thank you for walking us through the suggested changes. What I am hearing is the recommendation for today is to update these bylaws to reflect the new 5-member commission so that we can have, you know, the integrity moving forward here with our new 5-member commission. And that if the commission desires to do a more thorough review or update of these bylaws, that we would do so at a future meeting. And so I think I'd like to take a moment to just poll the other commissioners to make sure that you're comfortable proceeding in that direction today. Would you, with a show of hands, indicate if you're comfortable proceeding accordingly?
I just have a question, Allison. Are you
Yes,
saying,
please.
did we change rule number 6 to reflect the majority?
I think we need further discussion on that item, and then we may be ready for a motion. Would anybody like to initiate discussion on Rule 6? Yeah, Commissioner Wiedemann.
I would like to keep it to the majority of the commission rather than 4/5.
Great, and I could certainly support that. I have to admit, I'm unclear on what type of item this might be that would come before the commission that would fall under the category of questions laid over by request. And being that I'm unclear what those items might be, I'm less comfortable requiring a supermajority and would be comfortable requiring a majority if, you know, I'm open to other compelling reasons why it may need to be supermajority. I just haven't heard that rationale yet. Any further discussion on that item?
Sure, Purnell, this is Deputy County Councilman. I see Commissioner Jones with her hand raised as well.
Okay, great. Commissioner Jones.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So one thing I thought we could do is just Google it and find out what it means before we vote on it. And then I had one other quick question, and I'm sorry, I didn't think of this until now. I should have brought it up earlier. But under the bylaws, under section 2, shouldn't we have an item that says to review current planning permit applications for conformance with the adopted planning documents and zoning ordinances? Because that's not listed, and that seems like one of the main tasks that we engage in, and it seems like that would be a good thing to have under duties, but I'm not sure.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Gadrowski, I have 2 points on section 2. I think that the issues of, say, use permits and things like that would be within the item of to carry out the duties specified by law. The county ordinances do specify a role for the Planning Commission on those things, so I'm not sure it's necessary to restate that in the bylaws when it's covered there. Going back down to the rules on the issue of laying over motions by request. That's where, when I'm looking at that, and again, worst case scenario, I think we just strike the change in terms of leaving it as it was prior to this suggestion. That being said, we're talking about any motions that could be debated by the commission, other than the working motion, can it continue to the next session day or any other date specified? So we're talking about continuances. And then the provided clause is specific to the idea that at the end of a calendar year, you'd require a supermajority to punt it to that next calendar year. And that could be in the case of anticipating that there could be a new commission coming in terms of terms changing of office. So I would presume the concept is before one commission, and this would mainly happen in terms of supervisor turnover, I think, and new commissioners being appointed as part of that, this rule would be forcing the Planning Commission to have a supermajority to say, yes, we're going to move this to potentially a different set of commissioners that next January, as opposed to simply a majority vote going forward. If the goal is to simply make this a vote of the majority, I think we would strike that clause that begins with the word provided. If we left it at 2/3, which again is realistically a 4/5 vote of the entire commission, then that you would leave the language as it was. But that's, in terms of thinking about what this would be used for, that's what I can look at the wording and say, it's the concern being why you want to have a larger than a majority vote moving this to the next calendar year.
Well,
How are the other commissioners feeling about the vote required under Rule 6? Commissioners Paulin or Morse?
I would be in favor of maintaining it as a supermajority. I think, as Deputy County Counsel just explained it, I think the idea of not, requiring a supermajority of the commission to punt it for a whole other year seems like it makes sense. It kind of forces our hand into dealing with things if we have put them off till the end of the year. And I don't think practically, given the 5-member size of the board, either a 2/3 or a 4/5 majority is functionally equivalent. And so I would personally vote for maintaining the 4/5 language as written by Deputy County Counsel.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Morse, do you wish to comment on this?
I would agree. I would agree with Commissioner Paulin and with County Counsel. I appreciate the fact that we looked up the meaning of what a laid over request was, because I had no idea. So thank you. But I would agree. I would vote that. I would vote for 4/5 as well.
Okay, great. Is Commissioner Wiedemann?
yes, and thank you, Matt, for clarifying that, because in that clarification, I agree, it should be 4/5. It makes more sense now to me. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm amenable to 4/5 as well. Okay, so for today's work on the bylaws, are there any other items for discussion before I call for a motion?
Again, I have one small one, but I saw Commissioner Jones had her hand up before I spoke, and I want to make sure I don't speak over her if she had something to say.
I will be in the minority here. I think 2/3 is perfectly adequate and gives you space at the end of the meeting, at the end of the year, if you don't have a quorum in your group, to be able to move something over to the next year if you need to. I would just worry that, you know, Christmas season, everybody's busy, people aren't traveling, and you have 3 people at a meeting, and all of a sudden you can't get 4/5. So you have to do business on something that you're not prepared to do. And I just think it's better to have more flexibility.
Through the chair, just Deputy County Counsel to make a point on that issue of the fraction. So if we had a 3 persons there at the end of the meeting, end of the year, and the debate was to continue it, a 2/3 vote of those would still be 2 out of the 3. And so that functionally no different than a 4/5 vote. But again, the difference, the 2/3 to 4/5 was really just trying to make that cleaner in terms of applying a 2/3 to a 5-member body. A supermajority of 2/3 will, in most cases, still be essentially a 4/5 vote. But we can undo that change in Rule 6, and it's still a supermajority.
Any other discussion on this item?
Just take a quick one on a different rule, on rule number 4, rules of debate on page 1 of the rules of procedure. It asks that we direct our questions to Mr. Chair or Madam Chair. And I wonder if in 2021 we can remove gendered language when it's not necessary and just have it be Chair and the Chair's last name.
I'm good with that.
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Godrowski, I think what we're hearing is then an additional change to Rule 4, where that first sentence would instead read, when any member is about to speak in debate, he or she shall respectfully address himself or herself to the chair.
And we could even say, they shall respect themselves to the chair.
Oh, you're being current. Very good.
Again, there are many people who don't identify as one or the other in a gender binary, and we don't need to enshrine it if we're going through the whole process of updating it right now.
That's I'm not opposed to making that change today, but I would ask that that be the last change not presented in red line that we would consider today, just for the sake of getting to our other items in a timely manner.
So through the chair, just a quick question on motion, Deputy County Counsel Matthew Godrowski. I believe the motion for this item would be to adopt amended rules and bylaws in the form presented to the commission with the added change to rule number 4, and that the first sentence should read, when any member is about to speak in debate, they shall respectfully address themselves to Mr. Chair, period.
I'd say to the chair.
Okay.
To the
Or
chair.
chair and their last name.
Yes, to the chair.
Yeah.
So I believe that that is the motion. Are we ready to make that motion? Would someone like to make it?
So moved. Do we have exact language that we need to read into the record to make this motion?
Deputy County Counsel Matthew Godrowski. So if the motion could be simply adopting the bylaws and rules of the Planning Commission in the form presented to this meeting in red line, with the added change to rule number 4 of when any member is about to speak in debate, they shall respectfully address themselves to the chair, period.
So moved.
And do we have a second?
I'll second.
Roll call vote. Commissioner Wiedemann,
Yes.
Commissioner Pollan,
Yes.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner Morris,
Yes.
Chair Purnell.
Yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Wonderful. And thank you to County Council for being lead on that and letting us put you in the hot seat as well. And moving on to agenda item 6B, which is our training on the Brown Act, ethics and planning processes. I will turn it back over to County Council.
Thank you, Chair Purnell, members of the commission. First of all, I will say I will try to respect your preferred nomenclature with the recent rule change. However, there's a very good chance that old habits are going to cause me to slip and refer to you as Madam Chair at some point. So please forgive me if I do. This is our training for Brown Act and ethics. I recognize we did this relatively recently for this commission, but there's been a pretty significant turnover. There's a few things that I'm going to want to touch on with this commission that are a little bit different than what I do in the generic training because of things that you deal with that a lot of other entities don't deal with on quite as frequent of a basis. And I do want to start with one of the obvious questions, since we have, I believe, 2 members of the bar on the commission. This training is not certified for MCLE credit. We do give out the AB 1, 2, 3, 4 certificates, but I have not taken this one to the bar for approval. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And the slide that says ethics in public service. Is my screen sharing, or are you able to see it?
We are.
That's the slide we see.
Okay. So this is the basic training that we provide for ethics, public service, and conflicts of interest. There's going to be a few things that I'm going to tailor a little bit to this commission specifically as we go along here, but the basic content and the primary purpose are going to be the same. In that I want to provide you with enough of a framework and an understanding to be able to recognize when conflicts of interests are potentially an issue and when to be asking more questions. I do not expect that, after a 1-hour training on conflict of interests in California public service, that any of you are going to be able to answer any of the complex questions that might pop up at some point in the future. And I will say, this commission, I probably fielded more conflicts questions for than just about any other entity within the county system. The nature of the work that you're doing seems to bring them to the forefront much more commonly. I think part of that has to do with the fact that there are a lot of specific projects that may be in proximity or to your either land that you own or businesses that you're affiliated with, or similar sorts of issues that have popped up in those sorts of contexts. But the number of permits, the use permits that you end up having to make rulings and determinations on can really raise a lot of issues that a lot of the other entities within the county just don't see. So, and as part of getting helping you understand the sort of the framework of the various rules that we're going to be dealing with here, and one of the things that I want is to help you understand the policies and the intent behind some of these rules. I find that the rules in this area can be somewhat arcane, but if you are able to understand sort of what they're getting at, that helps you recognize when there might be an issue that you need to do some follow-up on. I also, just one sort of general warning on this one, I do want to let you know, this is an area that can be very complicated, and there are areas in here in which there are related rules and overlapping rules. And one of the areas where people are most likely to get into trouble is where you actually analyze it under one rule, but there's a second rule that applies. And there are situations, for example, where recusal might not be enough because even though under the standard test under the Political Reform Act, recusal would be the appropriate remedy. You might be dealing with a Government Code 1090 issue or something similar where recusal is insufficient. So, part of the point I really want to drive home is that when you have an issue, you want to follow up on it. You don't want to just think, oh, I've done X or Y, and therefore, I'm safe. So, one of the main sort of points that we want to start with here is the idea that public service ethics is different from, what you may think of as ethics or morality, in life generally, in that we've got not only different rules, but different policies that are underlying them. In many cases, you will find that the ethical rules here are not concerned just with the question of what's the right thing to do or what's the wrong thing to do, but rather they're concerned with making sure that the public on the whole is able to have trust in the government system. And as a result, there might be situations in which something that actually might be good for the government or good for the public on the whole might still be disallowed because it may give an appearance of impropriety that might sort of undermine trust in government. I like to throw in this Nietzsche quote here because I think it kind of helps drive home the difference. I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on, I can't believe you. And that's really what we're concerned about. It's not the consequences of a one-off decision and is this going to be good or bad? The question is, is the public on the whole going to have trust in the system going forward? And trust is very easy to lose and very hard to earn. It can take really just one case in which things don't smell right can really sort of damage trust in the relationship going forward. And in government, one of our key functions is to make sure that we're keeping the system operating in a way that the public can understand and recognize it is acting appropriately. So I also like to make a distinction here as we jump into this between what I refer to as big E ethics versus little e ethics. This is the distinction where sometimes we'll use the term ethics to refer to sort of, what is right, what is moral, what do we think is the right thing to do? But when we capitalize the E, when we're talking about ethics in this context, what we're generally referring to is some set of rules that have been set forth. And the question of whether the rule is right or wrong may be open to debate. Reasonable minds can disagree as to what the appropriate dollar threshold is for a financial conflict of interest, or what should be the appropriate dollar amount for a reporting requirement on your Form 700. But at the same time, those are, when we talk about it in those contexts, those are the ethical rules. So what I don't want is there to be too much confusion sort of between the sense of what is ethical generally versus what are the ethical rules that we're dealing with.
Councilor Curtis, I wanted to point out that your slides are not advancing with your presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you seeing the are you seeing just the slide, or are you seeing a slider on the side that shows?
We're seeing the slide with the slider on the side, but the main slide that's showing right now is the slide number 1.
Okay. Give me just one moment here.
Sure.
I'm going to stop the share and then resume with the slightly different window. Give me just one moment. Okay, now are you seeing just the slide?
We are seeing Big E, Little E slide.
Okay, and you don't see something off to the side on either the right or the left?
On the right, we see next slide, and also if you had any notes, we'd be looking at your notes.
Okay. How about now?
Same.
Okay. Well, usually that change does it. I may be presenting just in this format then, if this will work for you.
I think this will be fine.
So, you know, the next point that I like to make on this is, you know, not to trust your instincts too much. So there is, you know, there's a concept that legal scholars use to refer to some things being bad because, or some things we prohibit because they are bad, and some things are bad because they're prohibited. You know, coming into this, none of you are going to need me to tell you that bribery is wrong or that embezzlement is wrong. You all understood that intuitively without me having to cite to you the specific section of the Penal Code or the Political Reform Act that prohibits those activities. On the other hand, there are also going to be things in the rules that are not going to be so intuitive. That are not going to be things that you can just sort of make sense of on your own. And where you get into trouble is when you confuse the two types. You start to rely on the instinct in an area that isn't driven on instinct. So just, you know, to explain the distinction, you know, some of the classic examples that would get used are, you know, generally, you know, murder is considered to be inherently wrong. And, you know, you don't need to check when you go from state to state as to whether the state that you're going to outlaws murder. On the other hand, a right turn on a red light may vary significantly from location to location. It's not something that you would be able to just sort of intuit from, you know, being part of modern society. You know, you would need to actually look up the rules and understand what the difference is. So the key here again is to be spotting the things that might create an issue and then to be doing some follow-up, whether that's talking to agency counsel, whether that's getting an opinion from the FPPC, or you know, in some cases you may even want to consult your own attorney or do some of your own research on some of the issues here. We're going to cover 4 groups of ethical laws here. Those covering personal financial gain, personal advantages and perks, government transparency, and then laws relating to fair process. Government transparency, a lot of that's going to be the Brown Act, which will be the second half of this training, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on that. Oh, are you currently seeing the slide that says 4 groups of ethical laws?
No, it hasn't advanced since the Big E, Little E slide.
Huh. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try this again. My apologies. I did this a few times earlier in the year, and it seemed to be working okay then. Thank you all for bearing with me. Okay, how about now?
I'm seeing don't trust your instinct. Do you want to try going back or forward a slide to see if we have it here? All right, it looks like this might work this time. I'm seeing 4 groups of ethics laws.
Again, thank you all for bearing with me. I was saying the governmental transparency, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on because a lot of that's going to be covered in the Brown Act, which will be the next training here. But I am going to spend a little bit more time on laws relating to fair processes than I do in my generic training, because you actually deal with a lot of things there that some of the other agencies just don't experience. So, the first group of conflict of interest laws has to do with personal financial gain. Generally speaking, the principle here is that the public servants should not be benefiting financially from their positions. The rule that we have articulated here is actually from the Political Reform Act and the appropriate regulations. Generally speaking, public official may not make or participate in making or use their official position to influence a decision if the decision will have a reasonably foreseeable and material financial effect, indistinguishable from the effect on the public generally on their financial interests. The first chunk of these that we're going to refer to, bribery and similar crimes, these aren't actually in the Political Reform Act. These were pre-existing rules. And again, these are the ones that I think are probably the most intuitive here. Generally speaking, the public officials may not solicit or receive or agree to receive a benefit in exchange for their official actions. You can't receive a reward for appointing someone to public access, and then you can't convert public funds or property to your own. That last one is actually the trickiest one. We're going to touch on that a little bit more. So beyond just the crime of embezzlement, there are also rules that prohibit use of public property for personal purposes, and additionally use of public property for any political purposes. So there are situations in which it's not as obvious, if you're using the public property in a way that does not particularly seem to be harming the government, it may still be prohibited. It may still be something that isn't allowed because there's a desire in the law and the underlying public policy to not have the public resources used by the public servants in a way that's going to be benefiting them personally. So conflicts of interest in the Political Reform Act, this is the same rule that I articulated before, but the general policy here is that we want our public officials to be exercising their functions and their obligations in a way that is based on their determination as to what is best for the public, right? They shouldn't have an interest. They shouldn't have a temptation, regardless of whether they would be putting that aside, regardless of whether they may be able to make the right decision regardless. We simply don't want there to be a situation in which that's something that's going to be impacting the judgment at all. So there are 5 specific types of financial interest that this applies to. That statement is a little bit inaccurate because the last one is the personal financial effects rule, which is kind of a catch-all. But generally speaking, there are going to be specific rules governing any sort of financial interest in a business entity, any sort of financial interest in real property, sources of income to the public official, sources of gifts, and then personal financial effects is going to be anything that may have a reasonably foreseeable effect on the finances generally. A lot of these are going to be very similar. One of the big differences when you're looking at them is just the FPPC has put out regulations that put slightly different rules and guidelines in place for each of these types of issues. So how you analyze a conflict regarding a piece of land may be different than how you would analyze a conflict regarding a business entity or a source of income, et cetera. Generally speaking, there's going to be a potential conflict of interest in any decision which impacts the business entity in which the public official has direct or indirect investment worth $2,000 or more. Any real property in which the public official has a direct or indirect investment worth $2,000 or more. Incomes, any sorts of income that's $500 or more in aggregate over the last 12 months. Same with gifts. And any business entity in which the public official is a director, officer, partner, trustee, employee, or holds any position of management. This one's important to remember. It's not just the shareholders of a company that may be disqualified. Officers may essentially have conflicting duties to the corporation that would disqualify them from participating in the decision. So here's just a rough summary of the thresholds here. They update these every few years. You know, I believe I checked on these this January, but every year or two you gotta check again. So the regulations do get updated to reflect primarily inflation, but the changes in the standard of what is appropriate there. And then this one is very unlike. Oh, I'm sorry. I see we got a question.
Thank you, County Council. Just a question before we move too far out of it. In terms of the indistinguishable from impact on the public at large, I'm curious how broadly that impact on the public at large is considered. And I'm thinking about the fact that I'm sure there's planning commissioners here who own real property, and that we might be making recommendations that would impact a particular zoning designation that our property might be in that would not affect the entire public of Mendocino County. And I'm curious how broadly it has to be distinguished from everyone in the county, or as opposed to a class of which a commissioner might be a member of.
Yeah, so they actually have in the regulations, the FPPC used to say about 10% of the people in the county being affected similarly. Now I believe they updated it to 25% as sort of presumptive. That being said, you know, zoning can get a little bit complicated because you may have a situation in which there's a zoning designation that's pretty broad and pretty common out there. So, you know, a change to residential, for example, may not be particularly significant, or maybe something that could reasonably be equated as to the impact on the public on the whole. There are some things that may be hyper specific that may potentially create something that does look more like an actual conflict. We actually had a situation where one of the members of our board of supervisors, this was a little bit before my time, but had disqualified himself from a zoning question on exactly that issue. And ultimately the FPPC ended up returning an opinion or an informal opinion letter that had determined that in the particular case, the interest was sufficiently generic because the program is something that would be applying to a broad enough range of parcels. So I'll say that's a pretty vague answer. We have to analyze sort of what it is in light of the particular conflict and the particular issue that's going forward. The rule of thumb in the regulations is 25%. It gets a little bit more complicated than that when we're talking about zoning, because you have to look at things as to you know, how broadly are we really characterizing this in terms of, you know, people being in the same boat or not in the same boat.
Right. And I guess just on that same note, I'm curious about, again, this is back on the slide where it says the general rule is that we're not to participate or use our position to influence ones in which we would have a financial interest. And I'm curious about what qualifies as participating in or influencing in the case of, I'm just thinking back to our last meeting when we were making a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors for the adoption of an ordinance, which would have, again, depending on what way the Board of Supervisors go with it, could have potential implications for land and land values that we as commissioners might be living on. But ultimately, the decision on whether or not to adopt that ordinance is not in our hands. But I would imagine that, again, that general rule of thumb would apply, that we are in some way, by making a recommendation, using our official position to influence a decision that could have a financial impact on ourselves.
So, actually, I can expound on that a little bit. So if you were to have a conflict of interest that would be disqualifying, if there's any action that's going to be taken by the commission, whether that's recommendation or some sort of final action, you need to be disqualifying yourself and not participating in the vote. So you wouldn't be looking just at the question of, you know, is this a final action or not? you'd simply need to be recusing. The sort of classic situation where this would pop up would be, for example, if there was a specific project, if there is a rezone, for example, that includes, let's say we're not talking about a change in zoning designations generally, but we're talking about a rezone specifically of your property, or maybe a handful of parcels that are right next to your property. That would be a disqualification that would require you to not participate in the decision. And the classic, because you're not allowed to influence the decision, the guidance is to actually, this is a little bit different in the days of Zoom, but conventionally what you would do would be to step down from the dais and either leave the room or sit in the audience, etc. And there are actually specific rules as to when you can and cannot actually participate on an item as a member of the public. So for the conflict example that I just cited, that was based on you as an owner of real property, there's a specific rule that says you are allowed to participate in the same way as any other member of the public, but you're not allowed to be on the dais. You don't get the time reserved for commissioners to speak. You get the 3 minutes the public gets to speak. You don't get a vote, etc. There are other sorts of conflicts, though, that rule doesn't apply to, and you would not even, if one of those popped up, you wouldn't even be able to address the commission as a member of the public. And I will tell you, off the top of my head, I can't recite to you the full list. There is a list of the exceptions in the regulations. It's one of those things where when it comes up, the only reason I remember real property is because it's an example that I had not that long ago. But when those situations pop up, you have to check the list, see if it's one where you're allowed to participate as a member of the public, and if not, frankly, it's better to not even be in the room during the discussion of the item.
Okay. And can you share with us a link to that list in the regulations so that we could consult it?
Sure.
Thank you.
And I see we have another question from Commissioner Jones, I believe. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. So I have a question about the last one, director, officer, partner, trustee, employee management power. So specifically, if you're engaged in a business and somebody else comes before the commission with a similar
All right, special rules for contracts. This is one that I really sort of try and drive home with some of the other entities. I'm probably not going to spend as much time on it for the Planning Commission, since the Planning Commission it isn't doesn't contract or doesn't have contracting power and isn't generally involved in contracting. But the general rule I want you to be aware of here is that there is a statute that applies specific rules for contracting with a government entity, and it prohibits not only an individual from contracting on both sides of the equation, but a member of a body from contracting. So what I mean by that is that if you are a member of a board and that board wants to contract with you or your business, or otherwise enter into a contract that you are personally financially interested in, you may not, your board might be categorically disqualified from entering into that contract. So recusal would not be enough. An example I had only heard about sort of indirectly, but I had my mother used to be a teacher in a school district, and one of their members of their school board was the husband of their I believe it was the superintendent or other sort of direct report to the board. And when that happened, he ended up resigning his position because it created a conflict of interest that wasn't going to be something that could be recused or that could be addressed just by recusal. There are a litany of what are referred to as remote interests or non-interests that are defined in 1091 and 1091.5. I believe there's a total of about 50 between all of the different rules that are set forth there. And those get highly specific. So those are ones, if you think that the interest is something, so remote interests are ones that can be addressed by recusal. Non-interests are ones that don't even require recusal to be addressed. But the big caution on this one is that if you're dealing with a potential contracting situation, or where you're on a body that would be buying or selling or surplusing or in any way engaging in some sort of financial transaction, you can't be the person on the other side of it, even if there is a recusal, unless you fall in one of the very specific exceptions. And just to give you an example of how specific they can be, one of them refers to a program for, I believe it's rebates on energy efficient appliances under rules established by the FPPC, by the CPUC for specific types of rebate programs. So they get highly specific in terms of the types of things that may be accepted. Violations of 1090, I refer to this one as just downright draconian. A contract made in violation of 1090 is void and unenforceable. That's void, not voidable. There's no way for the government entity to ratify the contract, even if the other members think it's a good idea. Contract in violation of 1090 can result in disgorgement of the contract benefits, and a willful violation of 1090 is punishable by a fine of up to $1,000 or imprisonment in the state prison. And that also carries with it a lifetime ban on holding any sort of public office in California. Just to give you a little bit of additional context here, this has been interpreted as pretty broadly. So there's actually an attorney general's opinion out there that involves, I believe it was a member of a city council who was involved in the early planning stages of a small business loan program, and sort of helped get the city to establish this small business loan program. And then years after he had retired, he wanted to apply same way as everyone else to the loan program and to be getting the same benefits of everyone else in the city. And the attorney general opined, no, if you have that role on the front end, even though he wouldn't be involved at all in influencing or approving his particular loan or this particular contract, the fact that he was involved in the early stages of getting this program set up were disqualifying. And there are other situations in which participating in just the early stages of planning for a contract, even if you're not selecting the particular vendor, even if you're not establishing all of the terms of what the contract would be, may be disqualifying and may be something that prohibits participation. Moving on, conflicts of interest and campaign contributions. This is more relevant to the elected officials. Your body is appointed, but still important to be aware of, since some of you may run for other office or be involved in other political campaigns. So generally speaking, the party or the agent may not contribute more than $250 while the proceeding is pending or for 3 months thereafter. So you can't ask them for a campaign contribution while their item is in front of your commission. You can't receive the campaign contribution while the item is in front of the commission, and then for 3 months thereafter, those same things are prohibited. Additionally, if you had previously gotten a campaign contribution of $250 or more from that applicant, you're going to be disqualified from ruling on their application for, I believe it's a period of 12 months after the donation has come in. Conflicts of interest when leaving office. This is one sort of good to know about, but doesn't come up a whole lot on the local level. Generally speaking, there are restrictions on certain activities that are engaged in after leaving office. The idea here is there's a concept that scholars refer to as regulatory capture, that essentially an idea that in some cases, the regulators may not be serving the interests of the public, but may be serving the interests of the regulated businesses. And part of the way that can happen is that the people who are working as the regulators may be, there may almost be a revolving door between the employment in the regulated industry and employment among the regulators themselves. So there's essentially a ban on certain types of activities related to certain high-level officials engaging in employment where they would essentially be turning around and soliciting the same government employer after they have left. And then additionally, a ban on influencing prospective employment. So if you, essentially, if you have a situation in which you may be applying for a job with this particular candidate, or someone who has an application pending in front of the commission, you may have to go ahead and affirmatively recuse yourself. Or if you know that it may not be quite so far as the interview stage, but if you're applying for them or know that you're likely to be soliciting work from them, you may need to disqualify. So just general best practices here. Avoid any temptation to look at public service as an opportunity for financial gain. And I would add to that, avoid situations in which there would be a temptation, right? Part of this is not just about, are you going to be tempted, but rather, is the public going to perceive you as being tempted? Is there a potential for any level of cognitive dissonance in your decision-making process, or is there a potential for the public to sort of see you as biased or skewed in how you were exercising your governmental functions? Just generally look at every decision and ask whether it involves some kind of financial interest for you. I will let you know, one thing that we've had to deal with from time to time has been a conflict of interest does not become obvious until we're in the middle of a meeting, right? And it's always better when we can identify those issues in advance and we can do the analysis in advance. For example, I had an assessment appeals board meeting where we were halfway through the presentation by the appellant, and one of the members of the board had to say, counsel, I just realized this is a property that I have shown. until they started describing it in detail, I didn't know exactly what this property was. I have to recuse myself. It's always better when we can identify those things sooner and ideally in advance of the meeting. So when you're looking at the materials, when you're looking at the packet in advance, just sort of keep an eye out for anything that may be creating some sort of financial conflict of interest. And then, we do encourage you to go ahead and ask for any advice when you see a potential financial conflict of interest. I do have to give you the sort of the standard disclaimer. I am the county's attorney. I am not your personal attorney. We do provide some assistance and guidance as to where we think that there's a conflict of interest. That being said, the obligation ultimately falls to you. There is case law out there that says if you relied on the agency's attorney and the agency's attorney was wrong, there's no protection there. It's just on you. So of course that raises the question, why are you listening to me to begin with? Hopefully I'm significantly more right than I am wrong, but if nothing else, I can help you identify where the landmines are on this. And then if there is a potential conflict, the other thing that we can do, and we have done, is to help you in obtain a letter from the FPPC giving an opinion as to whether or not there's a conflict in a particular situation. I will let you know there's also some authority that says that relying on the FPPC is not some protection either, but as a practical matter, if they've told you it's fine, you're much less likely to be getting into any sort of trouble. It's one thing where agency counsel might have made a mistake. It's another thing where the FPPC itself has opined that something is okay, since they are the regulators in this context. Group 2, personal advantages and perks. Just generally, this is similar to group 1, except that it's not going to be dealing with situations in which there's a decision that may influence your personal finances. This just has to do with personal financial gain that might be received just by benefit of having the office. And the general idea here is that the public employees should not be receiving sort of special perks by virtue of being government employees. There's sort of a sense that people might have an ability to sort of cash in on the office, and that we want to discourage that, both in terms of the potential perception of bias or favoritism generally, but also what does that mean for other people out there who aren't giving the gifts, right, or aren't somehow conveying some special benefit on government officials. We don't want anyone to think that they have to be somehow providing something of financial value to the government to be treated fairly and equally with everyone else. So generally speaking, there's a prohibition on receiving gifts from anything of value, or a gift of $520 or more in a calendar year. That $520 is as of January of this year. I will let you know the rules here so that again, that's going to be an aggregate. The rules here are going to be slightly different than the rules on where you have a disqualifying interest because of a gift under the Political Reform Act. And the differences are going to have to do with minutia that I'm really not going to get into right here. But generally speaking, things, you may have a gift that is not just categorically prohibited here. For example, you may have a gift from a relative or a family member, something that is allowed under this rule, which under the other rule would still constitute something that might require you to disqualify. So the thing to be aware of here is there's really sort of two different sets of rules on gifts. One where they're simply prohibited, the other where even if it's an exception and it isn't prohibited, may still require you to disqualify. And then there's also limitations on the receipt of honoraria. Honoraria is one of those words that we don't use a lot in everyday conversation. Generally speaking, it's referring to any sort of payment for a speech given, article published or attendance at any public or private event, meal or similar gathering. This is essentially where there be, say, a workaround where people figure out they can't give a gift to a public official, but they're happy to spend a lot of money to get them to make an appearance, give a speech, whatever that's going to be. And for those local officials that are designated, they're not allowed to receive the honoraria payments. So then that takes us to our third category here: misuse of public resources. So this, I touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of embezzlement. Generally speaking, I think everyone knows that if you're taking money out of the county's accounts and putting it into your own bank account, that's embezzlement, that's theft, that's wrong. You shouldn't do it. And none of you needed to come here to an ethics training to understand that that was wrong and that that was prohibited. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, though, is when it has to do with things like, the image we have here is of someone using the photocopier. Things that may have certain non-obvious sort of impacts on the government entity. Things like using a government email for personal purposes, or using a government letterhead for personal purposes. One of the areas, for example, that we have to deal with in our meet and confer obligations with our sheriff's deputies is we as a government employer can allow them to take their patrol vehicles home if that meets certain public purposes. Specifically, if we expect them to be responding from their home to calls on an emergency basis. If that were not the case, then simply allowing them to use the vehicle for the personal commute may be an improper use of government resources. There's the rules in this area do allow a certain amount of de minimis use. The one that's called out really specifically is a small amount of personal use of a government telephone system. So when my wife calls me at work to ask me if I can, stop by the store on the way home, that's not prohibited, as long as that's not something that I'm not, for example, terminating my account on my personal cell phone and then taking all of my personal calls on my work phone, right? I mean, that would be prohibited, but a certain amount of occasional phone call, et cetera, is not. So another area where this becomes important has to do with reimbursement policies. You want to make sure that you're actually following your policy on if there's any sort of travel or meal that may be reimbursed. Something that may get if something is reimbursed improperly, that's potentially misuse or embezzlement of public properties. Spouse and partner expenses are generally not reimbursable. I actually like the county's policy on travel on spouses. I think it sort of highlights this point quite well. Under the county's policy, if I go to a conference and the county is paying for my my room at that conference, I'm allowed to have my wife come stay with me in that room as long as it doesn't increase the underlying charge. If there is, however, an extra charge for having a second person in that room, I, as the government employee, have to pay for that personally. That's not something that I can charge to my management training funds or department expense. This is an area where it is possible through some confusion for people to actually get themselves into some trouble. And then related to the private use of public resources is the political use of public resources. And there are some specific rules here that prohibit the government from using government resources on things that are going to be submitted to the voters. So that can be things that are for or against a particular candidate. The one where I think it's a biggest issue for, say, the county or for cities is that under the California Constitution, there are certain acts that a county or city can take that may have to be submitted to the voters for ratification. So, for example, if the county passes a tax, if the Board of Supervisors decides to enact a tax, that then has to be submitted to the voters for approval. The county resources can be legitimately used in drafting the tax, in getting all those materials together, in determining how it's going to be used, and presenting that to the board. But once it goes out to the voters, we cannot be using any sort of county resources, and that's including county staff time, in terms of encouraging people to be voting yes or no on the tax. The idea here is that the taxpayer resources simply should not be going to influencing the voters. And just one sort of note of caution on this one. There is a particular rule that allows a government entity to put out a what's referred to as an informational item on something that is going to the voters. So, for example, if there was a resolution that was out there and there was a desire to sort of inform people as to the consequences of it, there is an exception that allows that to go forward. That being said, that line is hard to draw, and it's very likely to be subject to challenge. You know, when is an item informational versus when is it advocating for or against something? And so if you're in a situation where you may be looking at anything along those lines, you know, I would strongly encourage you to talk to counsel in advance, to try and make sure that it's as defensible as possible. And frankly, in some cases, it's simply not worth the risk, because the backlash of being sued over potential improper use of funds can in and of itself undo any good that you were trying to cause. Group 3 transparency laws. As I mentioned before, we're going to be touching on the Brown Act in the second training here. But the general idea here is that you know, we live in a representative democracy. The ultimate accountability is to the voters, and the only way that the voters can sort of exercise that authority is if they actually know what's going on, and that requires that some of the meetings be noticed, be published, that the voters and the constituents can sort of see what's going on, understand the decision-making process, and it also requires that a lot of the records, the things that are used in government, are open to inspection to the public. So I'm not going to go a lot into the Brown Act right now, but generally speaking, you know, it's the rule that requires you to be meeting in a public manner, to be not having discussions outside of the meeting that would involve a quorum, etc. Public Records Act, I do want to spend a little bit more time on, because one of the things that I want you to understand is that any document that is made or used or retained in the course of a government's business is sort of presumptively public and is open and available for inspection by the public. And some of you will be very familiar with this, some of you won't, but any email that you send, any text message, any document that you generate is going to be presumptively public and open to inspection. Now, there's 50 or 60 exceptions to this that are written specifically into the code. So there's a lot of different things that we have to look at to determine what does and does not get released. But one of the things to be aware of is that any time that you are writing any of your email, and that is going to include anything that you are sending from a private account that is related to the conduct of your business as a member of the Planning Commission, is something that the public can request through a Public Records Act request, and something that may have to be disclosed and ultimately made public. So just a few sort of pointers here. One is you always, even if you're thinking, you're in a relatively informal setting, you're having some informal correspondence with a staff member or a member of the public or something else, you want to be careful about maintaining as much of a professional tone as you can, because the audience to that document, that comment, may be much, much broader than who you're thinking of with the time that you're hitting the send button. But another thing about this is that I like to encourage members of our various boards and commissions to try to avoid using personal devices or personal accounts when engaging in a planning commission or county activity. And the reason for that is that we can have an obligation to go ahead and disclose the materials, even if it's in your personal account. And the challenge with that is logistical, right? If you're using a county email address on something related to planning commission business, it is relatively easy for us to go ahead and have information services perform a search, come up with the responsive materials, and then we can review and provide those. It becomes logistically a lot more difficult if we have to go engage in a multi-step process where we're giving you specific search terms to try and input into a personal email account. You're having to review some of those, and we're trying to communicate as to what the appropriate standard is for what would need to be then turned over. So, the general best practice here is to try and avoid using personal accounts. I will say that doesn't always get adhered to, and I don't know that we have a formal policy to that effect, but it is something I would consider best practice. And I see we have a question.
Yeah, so I have a question on that. We don't have a county account, I don't believe. I mean, do commissioners have a county account? And if we do, I'm not aware of it.
I know that we've created one for a lot of different positions here. I might actually look to the planning staff on this. I would, if not, I may ask them to work on getting one created, because that should be a relatively straightforward thing for us to be able to do.
It seems like it'd be a good idea, because I know, like, I have one email account and I get a lot of email in it, and I would hate to give it to you because there's a lot in there
of this is know your hat, there are going to be different sets of rules that are going to apply to you in different contexts. And the Planning Commission is probably the entity that has to deal with this the most. I think, frankly, even more so than the Board of Supervisors, in that you really have two major functions. One is what I would refer to as legislative or advisory to the legislative body. That is, when there is a proposed plan to the general plan, or a proposed change to the general plan, a proposed change to a zoning law, if somehow we are going to change the rules as they apply to everyone, then you are acting in essentially a legislative capacity, which means that you're supposed to be taking in a lot of community sentiment, values, input, etc. But then there's also situations in which you're making determinations on use permits or applications where people have come in, and your job is to apply the rule to those people. And in those contexts, you're considered to be what's called quasi-judicial. That is, a lot of the rules and standards that would apply to a court are applying to you. So it's not quite all the same. It's a little bit looser. Things that may be required for, say, a jury might not be required for an elected or administrative body, but the same general principles apply, and that you are supposed to be a neutral fact finder who is applying the rule to this applicant that's coming in front of you. And the reason I think that this can get confusing is because there are things that you are essentially supposed to take into account on the legislative side that you're supposed to disregard on the quasi-judicial side, in that things like community sentiment, voter input, what people would like the rules to be are supposed to be applied in the legislative context, but they may be inappropriate on the quasi-judicial side. So to give some examples of this, one of the cases that I think really sort of illustrates it quite well had to do with a situation where there was a city council that wanted to change its rule. I believe this one had to do with building height in a particular zone, right? So there was an area of the city that they were in the process of studying and reviewing a change to reduce the height of the buildings that would be able to go up in that context. And for certain procedural reasons, they had 3 votes to do it, but they couldn't do it right away. They still had to go through some processes. They had to go through additional studies, and they had to, I believe it was actually their planning commission had to report and make a recommendation on it, and to send it back to their city council for action. While that was happening, they had an applicant for a use permit that wouldn't be allowed under the new rule. And that applicant came forward, and the city council denied the application for the use permit on the rationale that, well, we're changing this rule. We don't want this to go forward. We don't want these buildings to be going up in this zone, and therefore we're going to deny this permit. And the court said you can't do that. That the rule is the rule as it is on the books. You have some ability when you're wearing your legislative hat to change it, but until you've changed that rule for everyone, the applicant that's coming forward has a right to have the rule applied to them fairly, and the discretion that you have in issuing the use permit is not a discretion just to sort of make up the rules as you want, right? There's the one process for changing the rule. There's another process for applying the rule. And so when you're in the context of the use permit, the determination is going to have to be made on those factors that are relevant to the use permit, to the planning principles that are intended to be incorporated, and to the powers that are given to the entity in that setting. Other examples of situations where this pops up, So for example, there was one case in which a member, I think it was either a planning commission or a city council, had been out there sort of campaigning against a particular project, right? There was a project coming for a use permit. It was one that was a sensitive topic in the community. I'm sure that you've all seen some examples of those. This particular elected official, wrote, I believe it was a letter to the local paper explaining, why this was a bad project, why it shouldn't go forward, and this and that. And then ultimately, it comes to the hearing on the use permit, and that commissioner, I think, may have disclosed that they had written the letter, but said they still felt they were able to be impartial, and voted ultimately to deny the use permit. And the court reversed and said, essentially, you city, you failed to provide a fair hearing because one of the decision makers is someone who was against the project before it had come before the commission. That essentially, this is someone who had already made up their mind, who had an interest outside, and there was no specific financial conflict of interest like you have in some of your other contexts, but had an interest in an opposition to the project, and therefore could not be one of the decision makers who is hearing the evidence and making a determination as to whether or not this is going to qualify for a use permit. And I see we've got a question from Commissioner Jones.
Sorry to keep asking questions. So if another commissioner calls a commissioner and tells them their opinion about the project, and this is before the hearing has occurred, should we stop that communication from going forward? Like, it seems like that would necessarily mean that you would need to report that one of the commissioners has a conflict at the meeting. Like, that kind of conversation shouldn't be happening, correct?
Yeah, so there's sort of two pieces there. First is you got a potential Brown Act issue anytime you have one commissioner calling another. Now, if it's less than a quorum, it may not be a Brown Act problem. Now, I don't know that I would say you're categorically prohibited from discussing among yourselves before the hearing, but I would discourage it. The cases in which there's actually a reversal usually have to do with evidence, not just that. For example, there are some cases in which, say, a city council member may have heard from their constituents about a use permit that was coming forward, and they didn't express an opinion. They didn't say I'm for or against this project, but the constituents wanted to have their say, so they heard them out, and the courts have said, well, that's not illegitimate, right? That's part of the process when we have elected or appointed officials as the decision makers. They are going to be hearing from the public, and that doesn't show an impermissible bias. And I don't know that even a preliminary thought on the information in the packet would in and of itself rise to the level of showing a bias that would create reversal. So I don't want to say that you'd be categorically prohibited if you would, if you picked it up, you looked at the materials and you thought, well, this looks like a fine project, or this looks like it's going to need some conditions on this or that. I don't know that in and of itself is going to be depriving someone of a fair hearing. That being said, it's really, once you start to add up some of those things, or you've started to go out and publicly oppose something, or the more that you've said outside of the hearing itself, the more you're creating a record that allows someone who doesn't like the decision to come back and bring a lawsuit. And I will say that I look at this not just in terms of what is the right standard and what is the right thing to do, but how am I going to defend the commission's action if and when we get a lawsuit based on this. And so there are things that we look at in terms of yeah, certain comments outside of a meeting might not rise to the level of creating a lack of a fair hearing, but I would still encourage you not to make the comments at all, because everyone that you throw out there is just more ammunition to someone who might decide that they want to bring a lawsuit somewhere down the road. For the attorneys in the room, I would say you're trying to protect your record, right? You want to show that when this goes to the court, who and frankly to go goes to a superior court action, it's not unlike an appeal in that they're not there to sort of rejudge all of the facts. They're there to look at whether or not the process was fair and whether standards were applied appropriately. And what you don't want is a whole lot of evidence of statements made showing bias, statements made showing that a determination was made on information other than what was presented at the hearing. You want to be making sure that you're getting information presented during the permit application itself. Preferably not just part of the packet if it's an important detail, but something that's actually being discussed and addressed by the proponents of the project and by the opponents, so that you're really showing that you're making a decision based on the evidence and the facts in front of you, not just some personal bias or lobbying by a particular constituent or whatever the allegation is going to be. And Commissioner Jones, did you have a follow-up there?
I do. It's a little bit strange, and sorry to intersperse it here, but it seems like it's an appropriate point. So I am also
could answer on that. I will say the thing you really don't want to be doing is expressing any opinion on any permit in any other setting. So it's there is
these are not permit issues, they are actually regulations. So like the Oak Woodlands regulation, the marijuana regulation that we just looked at.
Right. And this is where I go back to the know your hat thing.
Right.
You're in two very different roles on the Planning Commission. When you are imposing regulations, you are a legislator. You're there like an elected official. You're supposed to be hearing from all of these different sources and taking all of these. If we think about it in terms of, say, a member of the board, right? I mean, they may have made campaign promises of, we're going to make this rule, we're going to make that rule, and the voters voted them in because of those. Where that gets a little bit tricky is that sometimes they go and make campaign promises related to specific projects, and if that happens, then they may have to recuse themselves because the standard on a specific application is, are we being fair to this person, right? So, and I find this to be challenging, not just in Mendocino, but really all around the state in terms of, it can get confusing. We have this whole use permit process, right? That requires a public hearing, requires an opportunity for public input. And yet there are times I almost feel like that process can be deceptive to the public because it suggests that it's almost like a popularity contest or like we're making a rule, right? It's not, do we want this business, whether I feel like I'm going to be treading on a little bit dangerous ground, but whether it's, Dollar General, whether it's Walmart, it's not, do we want this person in this place? It's, is this person allowed to do this in this place under these rules? Under these rules, the discretion we have, should we be imposing these types of restrictions for land use purposes? And it's an open hearing because, we want those concerns to be able to be raised by everyone out there. But oftentimes what we get in response is not, this is the this is the planning reason why I think you need to impose this condition, or, this is the planning reason why, this permit's inappropriate in this case. It's, we don't like this person, or we don't like this rule. And the problem is we don't get to change the rules based on who's in front of us, right? I mean, we have to apply the rule that we have at the time of the permit. And I would say that's one of the areas where it's sort of most likely for government officials to be getting themselves in trouble, because there may be a lot of public pressure, and the public may not understand the difference between this is when we're creating the rule versus this is when we're applying the rule. But the obligation ultimately really falls on you as the commissioners. So it's going to be difficult because you're going to get input that's not really related to what your actual function is there. And you're going to have to know which of that is going to need to be stuff that's going to need to be put aside, and which of that is the stuff that you actually need to focus on as to, this is an appropriate consideration for this particular project or not. And I will say again, Planning Commission is probably the one place that has to deal with this the most. And you really have to be remembering which of those hats you're wearing at which particular moment. Let's see, and then I mentioned that oh, sorry, it's 1099. I said 1095 on the incompatible offices prohibition. Generally speaking, there are certain offices that you can't hold at the same time. You can't be a member of a city council and a member of a board of supervisors in the same county, for example. If there's a potential conflict in the obligations of the two offices, it may be disqualifying. I will say there isn't a good list of sort of which offices are incompatible. The Attorney General has opined on this one in a way that you have to kind of go through what are the potential conflicts, and sometimes those questions can get a little bit academic or even esoteric as to do we really think there's going to be a conflict between the functions of these particular bodies. So just to continue on fair process laws, there's also, again, this is not one that you would be dealing with directly, but to be aware of, there are rules that with respect to government contracting that may require certain processes. So certain types of projects will require competitive bidding. Even things that may not require competitive bidding under state law, there's still likely going to be local requirements for some sort of competitive process if it meets certain thresholds. So the idea here is that we want government money to be spent wisely. We want all the businesses to have sort of a fair chance to compete, and we want to get the vendor that is ultimately going to be giving the best deal and the best product to the government. Additionally, there are some additional limitations when it comes to the campaign contributions. You can't solicit from employees. There's some disqualification requirements that may come into play if there are family members involved. A lot of these are areas where just if these things are to pop up, we want you to be prepared to ask questions and to know, not necessarily know all the contours of the rule, but know that this is an area that you need to get some clarification because you're in a potential minefield. All right, and I've gone, I think, considerably longer than I meant to on this one, and I don't usually spend a significant amount of time on these last slides. These are actually things that my predecessor had, but we have some additional resources that are available here. I also had a request for an email for the relevant regulations to be sent out to the commission. I'm happy to do that. As you're looking at the regulations, just one thing to bear in mind under the FPPC rules is that the FPPC rules are not the only rules, so there may be other types of conflicts or rules out there. And then additionally, they have the different categories there to sort of help you through the analysis to determine based on the particular type of financial interest that you're dealing with. So you can almost view it like a flow chart where you figure out the type of analysis and then figure out the appropriate rule that applies. All right, so before I move on to Brown Act, any questions on that? And does the Commissioner Purnell, does the commission want to take a break, or would you like me just to go on to the next one?
I need a break. I'm wondering if a 5-minute break is adequate, or do commissioners want a 10?
5.
Okay, let's go 5 minutes. It is 11:02, so I'll see you back at 11:07.
Great.
It looks like we're still waiting for our Commissioners Jones and Morse before we start.
How warm is it over there?
It was 80 yesterday. It's like, I haven't even been using my heater or anything. It's been so nice. Last night it was like 76 degrees, like at 7 o'clock. It's crazy beautiful here. Yeah.
Warm on the coast.
Are you on the coast? That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, warm on the coast. Warm.
Nice. Very nice.
Great. Well, we have all the commissioners back. I'm just checking to see if we have County Council Curtis and planning staff back with us.
I'm here.
Wonderful. I don't know if we have planning staff, but I don't know if we need them. I will just defer to you.
I'm happy to go ahead and get started if the commission is ready.
Wonderful. Let's do so.
Can you wait 1 minute? I have to have Scott start the stream.
So I have a question really quick before, we have a conflict of room use here. My partner is having an audit done so I need to rejoin by cell phone if that's possible.
That should be possible in the email invitation. There should be some numbers in there.
Okay, so I'm gonna leave and rejoin, and I'm sorry for this. I just found out about it, so forgive me.
Okay.
And while we're waiting, can everyone see the slide that I have up that says the Ralph M. Brown Act?
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm going to try navigating and make sure that we're not having any problems there. Are you seeing the next slide?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
All right, great.
Okay, we are ready to go.
Okay, take it away, County Council Curtis.
Sorry, are we still waiting on Commissioner Jones, or has she joined us?
I don't see her number showing up yet.
Would the chair like me to just wait a few moments for Commissioner Jones?
I'm comfortable proceeding, especially because we have all of the handouts provided, and I have a feeling by the time you get started, she'll be joining.
Fair enough. Thank you. So this is the second part of the presentation here, covering the Brown Act. So I believe you all have some familiarity with the Brown Act already. We are, however, living in some strange times with COVID. I'm going to cover both the basics of the Brown Act, but also some of the specific rules that we're dealing with during this COVID emergency. So just for context, the structure that we have of the meeting right now would not actually be allowed under the typical rules under the Brown Act, but the governor has suspended certain portions of the Brown Act in light of the COVID emergency in order to allow for better virtual meetings and to reduce risks associated with people gathering for public meetings. Just generally to start off with a history on this one, it's named after Ralph Milton Brown, member of the State Assembly. This was enacted in 1953. So a lot of the issues, there have been updates since then, but a lot of the issues that we run into with new technology, I think are really not contemplated, or were not contemplated at the time that the rule was drafted. So, one of the things to be aware of here is just, there are things where the application of the Brown Act to a digital world has been evolving, and there have been small incremental changes, some in statute, some in Attorney General's opinion, to sort of address the shifts in how all of this has been working, and sort of contemplate how all of this is going to interact with the new technology. The basic ideas and the basic idea of what a meeting should look like is, still the same idea that we had in 1953, which is that, the legislative body gets together in one location, the public joins, watches, and then has an opportunity to comment at that location. So we're going to cover a number of things here. Purpose generally, to whom the Brown Act applies, what constitutes a meeting, where the meetings can be held, notice and agenda requirements, and then I think one of the big ones for the moment is the COVID-19 rules. And I did want to say, I know, I think it was Commissioner Jones apologized about asking so many questions previously. Please do not hesitate. I feel sometimes when I'm doing these trainings via Zoom, I'm talking into a void. So I do appreciate the questions and the engagement, and I think we've got some good and thoughtful ones so far. So just generally speaking, when it comes to the Brown Act, the purpose is to be balancing the need for public interest, public debate, and as I touched on previously, the need for the voters to sort of understand how government is working and how the processes are working and how decisions are being made, with the need for, in some areas, legitimate concerns over things that would need to be kept confidential. Whether we're talking about closed sessions for things like pending litigation, we're talking about certain types of personnel information. The idea is to sort of define those things and to be sort of clearly setting the lines of what can be confidential and what needs to be out there and open for the public. This is the legislative policy. I like to read this one because I think it's a bit colorful, but it also does really get the point across. The act reads, "The people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created." And again, this basic idea is that ultimately it is the people, it is the voters that have the ultimate power and the ultimate, and that we are all ultimately accountable to. Many of us indirectly. Everyone here is appointed, but you're appointed by a body of elected officials. So to whom does the act apply? It's going to apply to legislative bodies as they are defined within the statute. Generally speaking, that's going to be the governing body of any sort of local government entity, any sort of advisory body or other body created by that body. So the Planning Commission is advisory to the Board of Supervisors, but it still falls within the definition of a legislative body. There are also a few areas where a legislative body may be a little bit counterintuitive. It can end up including, for example, the board of directors of a corporation that receives public monies and which has members of its board that are appointed by the legislative body of a local government entity. So there are a handful of things that are not particularly common, but can end up falling within the definition of legislative body. This is another one where I would say, if there's a question as to whether or not it's going to apply, you've got to go ahead and look it up. As I mentioned before, it's both the governing body and the subsidiary body, any board, commission, committee. There is an exception, however, for an ad hoc committee. Ad hoc is not actually used in the statute itself. It's sort of the accepted term to refer to this particular exception. but it refers specifically to a committee that is comprised solely of less than a quorum of the members of the legislative body which created it. It must be single subject and short duration. That's coming from Attorney General's opinion, which is distinguishing it from a standing committee, which is that within the Brown Act, it does refer to a committee that has ongoing subject matter jurisdiction. Essentially, cannot be an ad hoc committee. One of the cautions on this one is that when you have an ad hoc committee, not only does it have to be less than a quorum of the legislative body, it can only be the members of the legislative body. If you start appointing any sort of staff, if you appoint any other members of the public as members of the committee, then it can't be an ad hoc anymore. It has to be compliant with the Brown Act. And then just very briefly, Brown Act does apply not just to the members of those bodies, but to electees. So that's a person who essentially has been elected but hasn't yet been sworn in. The idea here is that it would be a huge loophole if, after the election, you were able to go around, talk to all the other members of the legislative body to push your particular agenda, and then avoid having the public discussion once you had actually been sworn in. So generally speaking, a meeting is going to be any time a majority of the members of the body get together at the same time at a location to hear, discuss, or deliberate any item within the subject matter jurisdiction. This has been interpreted by both court decisions and attorney general opinions to include situations in which no action is taken, and sometimes even items that are purely informational. So even if there is no discussion among the members of the body, a factual update can potentially be a meeting that requires public notice and has to be Brown Act compliant. So this is going to include both actual face-to-face meetings, but also any sort of teleconferencing and serial meetings we'll get to in a moment. There's also going to be a number of exceptions here. Let's see. Actually, let's start with the face-to-face meetings generally. So the board, anytime that the board is getting together, or anytime you've got a majority together, you have a meeting of the body that has to be noticed, and that doesn't matter whether you're meeting formally or informally. Essentially, any time that you might be coming together to discuss members within the commission's jurisdiction, it needs to be a formally noticed meeting and open to, and available to the public. It doesn't depend whether or not there's any final formal action. Doesn't depend on whether or not you decided to plan it in advance or if it was impromptu. Essentially, you're only allowed to talk among yourselves or among a majority of yourselves when it's in a noticed and public setting. Additionally, there's the act prohibits what's referred to as a serial meeting. Essentially, so this is now a 5-member body, and your quorum is 3. So if 2 of you discuss a particular item without a third person present, that's not a meeting of the body, and it's not a Brown Act violation. Now, as we touched on before, if it's related to a use permit or another quasi-judicial setting, there might be other reasons why you wouldn't want to be talking among 2 of you. But if we're talking about a zoning change, a general plan change, something along those lines, there would be nothing improper about 2 of you speaking outside of a meeting before you come to the public setting. The problem would be is if one of the 2 of you then talks to a third member. Now you have what's referred to as a serial meeting, which is that you didn't have a quorum in the same place in the same time. You weren't all discussing it collectively, but there was discussion among a quorum about the same subject matter. And the idea is that essentially that could be used to circumvent the requirements of the act if it were allowed. That would essentially create a situation in which the quorum could decide what they want to do outside of the public eye, show up, take the formal action, and sort of deprive the the public of the opportunity to see the discussion and the debate and the decision-making process. And so this is part of the reason or the rationale behind the ad hocs. You know, as I see it, you designate an ad hoc committee essentially because you know you're going to have supervisors or members of your body who are discussing an item outside of a noticed meeting, but you want everyone to know these are the two that are working on it. No one else should be talking to these two about the same subject matter. You essentially avoid a serial meeting by designating an ad hoc committee. And to be clear, this is going to refer to essentially any method of communication. It doesn't have to be in person, doesn't have to be by telephone, doesn't have to be, you know, could be email, text message, social media, any number of other venues or methods of communication. There was actually some relatively recent legislative update to deal with Facebook or social media generally, and the ability of a member of a legislative body to discuss something of public concern with the public at large on Facebook, but not allow other members to be essentially engaging in discussion in that forum that would potentially create a serial meeting. Interestingly enough, there was actually, in one of the early days of email, there was a question that was submitted to the Attorney General about whether or not the legislative body could set up essentially an online forum or an email group chain that was available to the entire public, posted to the entire public instantaneously, and otherwise allowing sort of an online discussion in a way that would be Brown Act compliant. And the answer was no. That even if you were to make one of those forums completely open and available to every member of the public, you still wouldn't be complying with the Brown Act, in part because you wouldn't be providing the public notice requirements. That essentially or the ability to have people be physically present and to be addressing the meeting or addressing the members of the body directly. So there's a handful of statutory exceptions. Individual context is probably the biggest one. So, you know, we talked about a little bit about a serial meeting previously. That doesn't prohibit someone who's not on the legislative body from going to each of the individual members and pleading their cases directly. So if you have, let's say, for example, we have a legislative change that's being proposed. Say the phase 3 zoning ordinance you were recently working on. There's nothing under the Brown Act that prohibits, you know, someone who wants to see a particular change in phase 3 to go to each individual member before the commission meets and to say, you know, these are all the reasons why I think you should do X or Y. You know, that is not considered to be a Brown Act violation because there's no communication among the 5 of you. The issue, though, is that if that person engages in the individual contact, what they can't do, or rather what is not allowed to happen, is for them to be relaying to you what the other commissioners said, because that can end up in the serial meeting. If they essentially end up as a pass-through, whereby your opinions or your thoughts are being communicated to the other commissioners or vice versa, then you can potentially have a serial meeting issue. And the thing is that the Brown Act puts that obligation on you, not on the member of the public. So, or staff or whomever. So if there's a situation where that's popping up, you know, someone comes to you and says, you know, I'm really in support of this new ordinance, or I'm really opposed to it. I want you to do this and that. And you know, that's fine. But once they start going into things of, and I talked to, you know, the other commissioners and they both want to do, you know, this or that, that's where you have to be the one that sort of, you know, puts up your hands and stops them and say, you know, I can't be going into that. You know, that's a potential Brown Act violation. You know, please don't be telling me what any of the other commissioners said. And I recognize that can be a little bit difficult to navigate sometimes because the members of the public aren't necessarily going to understand that in advance. So you just have to be careful in those contexts to be able to, you know, be prepared to spot that issue and to stop them when that's popping up. There's some specific statutory exemptions for conferences, community meetings, members of other legislative bodies, attendance of standing committees or social or ceremonial events. I will let you know every one of these has specific statutory requirements. The common thread is generally you could potentially have a majority at one of these settings, but they shouldn't be talking amongst themselves about the business of the legislative body. So essentially, if three of you want to go and attend a meeting of the Board of Supervisors, you're certainly allowed to go do that, or attend a meeting of a city council. You can do that, but what you can't do is sit there in the audience and talk amongst yourselves about what you want to do when you come back to the Planning Commission, et cetera. The ones that are, I think, relatively easy are the meetings of other legislative bodies and standing committees. Some of these other ones, conferences, community meetings, et cetera, there's also some requirements that may come into play that the event might have to be open to the public. Closed events may be not permitted, with a few exceptions to certain specific types of, I think it's the League of Cities and the California State Association of Counties being called out specifically as having some exceptions that are specific to their meetings. The meetings themselves have to be held within the jurisdiction. So for the Planning Commission, that means it has to be held within the County of Mendocino. The general idea here is that it needs to be in a location that's going to be accessible to the public generally, or the public that will be interested in these items. So, if we're meeting as the Mendocino County Planning Commission, you can't go to Vegas and have the meeting there, and then force anyone who's interested to travel hundreds of miles to go attend the meeting. I will let you know this requirement is currently suspended for the purposes of virtual meetings during COVID, but once we resume, there will still be a requirement that it be within the jurisdiction. There are some exceptions here. It's unlikely to be relevant to you, but essentially, for very small districts, there may be times that there's no suitable location within the jurisdiction, and so maybe the nearest location that's suitable, or in certain emergency situations, if there's no safe location within the district or within the bounds of the jurisdiction, then it may be that it's sort of the nearest appropriate location. Example I would use for that would be the town of Paradise. They're during the course of an emergency, if the entire jurisdiction is on fire or evacuated, it may be entirely appropriate to have a meeting the nearest location, or the nearest suitable location outside. So notice and agenda requirements for all the regular. So generally speaking, all of your meetings are going to have to be noticed, and you're going to have to post an agenda. The agenda is going to list the business that's going to be conducted at the meeting. The agenda should contain a brief description of everything, including the items to be discussed in closed session. There is specific form language that you can use for closed session items. It's not required, but it's considered a safe harbor. Essentially, if you mirror your agenda description of the closed session item off of what is in the statute, then you're considered to be Brown Act compliant. And it requires certain minimum levels of information about certain things, but it also sort of helps what you can steer clear of for appropriate confidential information. So the regular meetings, the agenda has to be posted at least 72 hours prior to the meeting. It does have to be, again, these requirements are modified somewhat during COVID, but generally speaking, it has to be posted at every location the meeting will be at. So, usually, for our Board of Supervisors meetings or for the Planning Commission, that's in the glass case outside of the admin center. It has to be, you don't have to have a website, but if you have a website, it has to be posted on the website. Additionally, then for special meetings, those are going to be the ones that aren't set by your regular calendar, resolution, bylaws, etc. Those are going to have to be posted at least 24 hours prior to the meeting. Special meetings can be called either by majority of the body or by the chair. And then additionally, there's some requirements for special meetings that the notice has to be received by every member of the body. at least 24 hours, and it has to be received by any essentially media organization. I believe it's specifically newspapers, radio, and television that have requested that form of notice in advance. So the reason I point that out is that 24 hours seems like not a lot of time, but if you are going to be doing a special meeting on short notice, you need to budget a little bit of extra time to make sure that you can actually get the agenda together and get it delivered to everyone appropriate by the time you hit that 24-hour mark. So I'm going to run through this a little bit more quickly, but here's just a few examples of potential non-compliant agenda item descriptions. And I will say this area I see this most commonly is where you have, say, a heading that gets mistaken by the body as an agenda item. So, for example, new business, old business. Sometimes you have an agenda structure where you have that as a category, and then you list the specific items underneath those. The thing is, you have to be aware that if that's your structure, when you get to that category, you need to be, if there's nothing listed there, you can't be just going into old business as a blanket item, or you can't bring up anything that's not agendized. There's specific rules for a process for adding an off agenda item if appropriate, but generally speaking, the published agenda is the agenda, and you're not going to be able to be adding additional business, even if you have some sort of catch-all phrase on your agenda, like other business. So generally speaking, under the Brown Act, the rule of thumb is that the agenda description doesn't need to be more than 20 words, but it does need to be detailed enough that the average person looking at the agenda is going to be able to understand the rough subject matter that that's about, and be able to make an informed decision about whether this is something they would want to be showing up for and participating in, or whether it's something they don't have an interest in. So off-agenda items, there is an ability in certain situations to act on an off-agenda item. The most common one that you're going to see is actually the last one on this list, which is that if an item came to the attention of the body after the agenda was published, or I would say after there was an opportunity to amend the agenda, so more than or within that 72-hour window for a regular meeting, for example, and there's a need to take some sort of immediate action on the item, then the legislative body can add it to the agenda with a 2/3 vote, and that's a two-step process. You first ask to add the item to the agenda. You make the vote about whether or not you think you have the findings to add it as an off-agenda item. And then if you do, then you can proceed to the discussion of the substance of the item itself. So, that's going to be the most common one. Emergency item, it's actually, I guess, a little bit more common than I would like. This is referring to essentially when you have a state of an emergency. So work stoppage or crippling disaster which severely impairs public health and safety. I will say, I may have spent almost the entirety of my time as county council so far in a state of emergency. So it's become a little bit more common than I would have preferred. When I first was studying the Brown Act, I thought, well, that's not going to be something I have to deal with very much. It's essentially the same process as for a typical off-agenda item, except that it's a majority vote rather than a 2/3 vote. And then lastly, you don't have to, you can take up an off-agenda item if it was posted for a previous meeting within the last 5 days. The basic idea here is, so for example, sometimes the Board of Supervisors will do meetings back to back. You will have meetings 2 days in a row, and there are some items on Monday's agenda and some items on Tuesday's agenda. Well, if we don't get to it on Monday, we can take it up on Tuesday, and we don't have to renotice the whole thing. And the outer limit of that is 5 days. So Additionally, there's a requirement under the Brown Act that any written materials be made available to the public. That's non-confidential writings. There are some specific rules as to what is allowed to be confidential. The clearest one, I think, is attorney-client communication. The legal advisor to the board can provide a confidential legal memo with any legal advice related to an item that would not have to be distributed publicly. Under the Brown Act, additionally, if it's exempt under certain sections of the Public Records Act, it may be exempt from the disclosure requirement under the Brown Act. It's not everything that's exempt under the Public Records Act is exempt under the Brown Act. So that is something that you have to take a look at. And then the rule is essentially those materials have to be made, quote unquote, without delay if they are distributed to the members of the commission. I do want to be clear, this does not apply to things that are sent in by the public. I ran into the situation a while back where a member of the public had sent in something, demanded that it be posted on an agenda item. In the opinion of the clerk of the board, it wasn't particularly relevant. In fact, I think in the case that I dealt with, it was actually campaign material. The rule is that if it's prepared by staff, if it's prepared by a member of the commission, it needs to be made available to the entire public. Now, the way that we typically do that is by posting it as part of the online packet. I find that that's the easiest. The rule that's actually in statute requires it to be available for inspection by a member of the public at the offices of the agency. I find if you post it online, you never have to go. If you post it online, no one shows up at the agency to go look at the physical copy of it. This is an old slide, back before we had quite so many emergencies. But there is a provision for an emergency meeting in addition to a regular meeting or a special meeting. Emergency meeting essentially would be if you have a state of emergency and there's a need to meet and you can't give 24 hours notice. Essentially, under those situations, a legislative body can go ahead and meet on less than 24 hours notice. There are specific requirements that you have to comply with, which essentially amounts to sort of best available efforts to provide notice to all the appropriate media organizations, members of the public, et cetera. And again, this would only be if you have something that is crippling disaster, work stoppage, or other activity which severely impairs public health, safety, or both. In my experience, even in a bona fide emergency, whether that's fire, COVID, or something else, this rarely comes up because you usually have time for at least the 24 hours notice needed for the special meeting. So we touched on this a little bit before. Special meetings, 24 hours notice must be received by the body and the media. You still need the notice, even if the only item to be conducted is a closed session item. So, for example, in my prior life, I represented a number of small districts. I was agency counsel for special districts that may not have in-house counsel. And from time to time, they would want to have a meeting, if we had, say, an item in litigation, where the only item on the agenda might be just that litigation. You still have to notice that one. You still have to have it open to the public. You still have to have an opportunity for the public to comment. And then you go into closed session, and then the bulk of the meeting is actually done behind closed doors in those situations. But just because the substance of the meeting is confidential doesn't mean that you get around your agenda and notice requirements. Closed sessions. So generally speaking, the assumption is that everything is going to be an open session item. The only items that are allowed to be discussed in closed session are those that are specifically authorized by statute. So the Brown Act has a number of specific types of items that the legislative body can discuss in a closed and confidential setting. Personnel matters, so that's going to deal with direct reports to an agency. That's not going to be relevant for the planning commission, but say the board of supervisors, if they want to do a performance eval of county council, that is, for example, a closed session item. Labor negotiations, real estate negotiations, I do want to emphasize for those of you that might be on other bodies, there is no general contract negotiations closed session. That's a bit confusing because there are specific closed sessions for certain types of contracts. So labor negotiations, the idea is you don't want the other side to know, you might be saying, we're willing to do this, but see if you can get them to agree to something a little bit less. Or real estate, we're willing to pay up to $1 million, but see if you can get it for 800,000. You generally don't want that to be done in open session. You don't want the other side to know it. So there are specific closed sessions to allow it. What's a little bit odd is that those same factors would come into play in all sorts of other types of contract negotiations. And yet there is no general contract negotiation closed session. Unless it's one of these specific types, you don't get to do it. And then there's a handful of other ones. For example, if there needs to be an update about information that may impact, facility security, or we actually had one on cybersecurity for the Board of Supervisors not that long ago, where there would be a need to update as to certain specific, vulnerabilities that you wouldn't essentially want public, but need to be, your legislative body needs to be made aware of. Those can be done in closed session. So there are specific agenda requirements for each closed session, as I touched on before. There's essentially a safe harbor. You go ahead and you phrase it the way that it's framed in statute you consider to be compliant. You may have to report out of closed session. Not every action taken in closed session is reported out, but the statute does define specific types of actions that have to be reported out, and may require that the vote be reported out as well. And then in terms of who can participate in the closed session, generally speaking, it's going to be members of the legislative body and any staff that they deem appropriate for the discussion. You don't, for example, get to use a closed session on pending litigation to meet with the other side. There was actually a case, I think back from 2011 or so, where a legislative body had met with a mediator in closed session, and the court determined that that was inappropriate. That the conference with legal counsel could be, you could meet with your attorney and maybe appropriate staff on your side, but the mediator was essentially an outside party and could not be brought in for the closed session discussion. And that was not entirely intuitive, given that mediations are themselves inherently confidential, and that the nature of the breakout sessions is something that would be something that would typically be handled in a confidential setting and be subject to its own confidentiality rules. So just generally speaking, when you've got a closed session, you want to make sure that you're making sure that whether it's a proper subject matter for closed session, whether whether you're clear about what you can and can't do when you're going in there, what the agenda and reporting requirements are, and what prior announcements need to be made, if any, and then what documents may need to be made available to the public. This is one I won't spend a whole lot of time on because the Planning Commission, I really don't know that there's going to be anything that's going to be an appropriate closed session that's falling under your jurisdiction. So general rights of the public. Generally speaking, in the Brown Act, the public has the right to have the meetings be open in public. We can't require conditions such as registration or other information attached to the right to attend a meeting. Essentially, you can't say if you're going to appear here at the meeting, you have to give us your name, your address, or other requirements. People are allowed to participate anonymously. It's a little bit awkward in the context of the digital meetings because we do have to have at least some sort of identifier, a screen name, or something. But people are allowed to essentially make up any anonymizing identifier they would like if they want to use a fictitious name, etc. That's appropriate. The public has a right to audio and video record. They can also have a right to broadcast the proceedings as long as they're not making a disturbance. So there's a right to videotape the recordings, the proceedings. There isn't a right, for example, to be able to push everyone else out of the way and get the best camera angle to be able to have a good view. or to interrupt or require that the members of the meeting face the camera or anything specific like that. And then, of course, the right to inspect records. Oh, and any recordings. You don't have to make a recording of a Brown Act meeting. Our regular practice for the county has been to do so, but it's not, strictly speaking, a legal requirement. That being said, if you do make a recording, it does have to be open and available to the public. And then additionally, the recording has to be saved for a minimum of 30 days after the meeting before it's destroyed. That actually came up in the context of those agencies that were doing a recording just for the purposes of helping them make their minutes. The rule that the legislature enacted was that you had to keep it around for at least 30 days so that the public would have an opportunity to request it, to make a copy, et cetera, so that it couldn't just be destroyed, as soon as the minutes were done. I mentioned the ability to broadcast the proceedings, the right to request and have a copy of the agendas mailed to them, and then the right to have a meeting held at a facility that does not discriminate, which was accessible to disabled persons. The one that this actually gets the trickiest on is that if you're doing telemeetings and it's not COVID, right now we're not required to have every location that a commissioner is at open to the public. But normally, when we're in non-COVID times, every single place that a commissioner might be participating from remotely has to be open and available to the public and has to be ADA accessible. So if you have a commissioner who's, say, out at a conference and they want to participate in the meeting, via telephone, via Zoom, whatever the technology is going to be, that meeting location needs to be open and available to the public. It needs to be noticed, and it needs to be ADA accessible. So that can be challenges if you have a challenge if, say, you have someone staying at a hotel in a remote location. They have to find a suitable spot that they can open to the public. In my experience, it's very rare that people will actually show up at those public locations, but that is the requirement under the statute. And I will say, years ago, I had one of my districts. One of their members was going to participate from a remote location, and they did end up with, it was on a contentious issue, and I think that, frankly, what one of the members of the public was sort of trying to make it deliberately difficult, but they submitted a extensive request for accommodation of a disabled relative that supposedly wanted to participate at the remote location in person, and all of the specific requirements that they would need for an ADA accessible restroom, and additional other requirements, in what frankly appeared to be an attempt to make it difficult for the commissioner that was going to be participating remotely to do so. So then, moving on here, generally speaking, public's access to documents. So under the Brown Act, there is a requirement that not just the agendas and that be made available, but all the materials distributed to the board members that are either prepared by staff or that are prepared by other members of the commission. There's generally a right for public input and testimony. So sort of two big areas here. One, at all of your regular meetings, the public has to have a right to address the commission as to any item that is not on the agenda. And we put that in there as a standing item on the agenda itself, so that it's clear that that opportunity is there. What you have to be aware of is that because it's items that aren't on the agenda, you're not going to be able to take action on anything they bring up, and you're not going to be able to get into any sort of detailed discussion about anything they bring up. You're allowed to talk about it just briefly for the purposes of maybe getting some clarification, or for deciding whether you want to put it on a future agenda, but you can't really get into the substance of the item, even if they bring up something in public comment that you really want to respond to. And then before every item on the agenda is acted upon, there's a right to have public comment on it. So the Brown Act allows some flexibility as to exactly when that is. It has to be before you've taken action. On the other hand, you can allow, say, a staff presentation first and then public comment. You can allow some measure of commission discussion and then have public comment. But if you do that, you want to make sure that you stop and you go to public comment before you actually get to any formal action on the item. Let's see, I just touched on the public comment there generally. And the agenda itself does have to reflect the opportunity that there will be an opportunity for public comment. The board does have some ability to go ahead and regulate the public input. This does not mean that you are deciding who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, or what they get to say. This is generally things like a time restriction. So Board of Supervisors, for example, has a 3-minute time limit set for individual speaker. The best piece of practical advice that I can give on this is have those rules and enforce them consistently. You don't need those rules until you really need them. And if you've been uneven or inconsistent in how you enforce the time limits, it becomes very difficult then when you have someone who wants to, feels very strongly about their item and wants to fight about, why did this other speaker get a lot of time, or, why weren't other people held to 3 minutes? Chair does have some discretion to go ahead and vary it up. If there's for example, the last Board of Supervisors meeting, there was an item that came up where it had to do with a contract with an outside federal agency. A representative of the agency called in during public comment to provide any information that may be useful to the board. Chair had appropriately exercised discretion to go ahead and say, well, we're not going to limit you to 3 minutes. We want to get all of the information from this agency that we think is appropriate. What you want to do is to avoid anything that's going to give an appearance of sort of playing favorites, but is providing enough flexibility for the commission to be able to do its job. You do get to, you can also impose a limitation as the overall amount of comment that gets, or the overall time for public comment. We haven't historically done that in this county. So frankly, there may be resistance if you were to start to do that. I would not do it selectively. If you're going to impose an overall time limit, I would suggest putting that in your bylaws, and then trying to be consistent about when and how you apply it. And then of course you have to reconcile that with any limits that may be imposed by statute specific to your public hearing requirements on specific types of items. You're not allowed to prohibit public criticism of policies, procedures, programs, or services. I would say, just also remember, you're acting as a government body, so you're subject to the First Amendment. You're going to have to hear people saying things that may be disagreeable or not particularly polite, and you have to give them some room to go ahead and to express their opinions, even if they seem unfair or sort of unproductive or unduly hostile. You do have some ability to restrict or to limit a speaker who has lost all sense of decorum or is becoming overly repetitious. Generally speaking, I advise against trying to go down that road. If you're running into that problem, it's usually better just to let them have their time elapse and then go on from there, rather than try and debate whether or not they had maintained some level of decorum. Also, if you have someone who's refusing to yield the floor or refusing to stop speaking after 3 minutes, you have some ability to have them removed or to clear the room. But usually, one of the most effective first steps is just to stop and take a recess. And they after they lose their audience, they sort of lose their momentum, and then usually we're able to sort of pick up and come back after some order has been restored. That's more of an issue for when we're meeting in person than when we're in these COVID times, but it is important to bear in mind. And so just a nice little graphic to summarize how it can sometimes feel when we're dealing with certain certain public speakers. And I just touched on those. So COVID-19 rules, there's a few differences that I really just want to make sure that you're aware of while we're in these COVID times. Some of these I'm sure you're already familiar with. We're operating under these rules, but I want you to know that these are the results of specific executive orders issued by the governor under his emergency authority, since we're acting in a declared emergency. And the general idea here behind these various rules is going to be that we're trying to limit public health risk, right? In normal times, we are required to have meetings locations be open to the public. We are required to allow the public to have the opportunity to gather. And in these times, a gathering is seen as something that presents a risk and a danger, both to the members of the body, but also to the public on the whole. So the various parts of the Brown Act have been suspended temporarily to help facilitate these sorts of virtual meetings that don't present the same risks. So just generally, it's going to be the requirements for having each of the locations open to the public, having a location that is open to the public at all, having a majority of the members participating from within the jurisdiction. Additionally, there's also a suspension of a requirement. This one's a little bit unusual and not directly in line with the others, but there was also an allowance to have agency staff provide updates on the COVID emergency to members of legislative bodies outside of a noticed meeting to keep them sort of aware of what's going on and to allow them to be able to respond to their constituents. That was happening a lot because early on in the emergency, there were a lot of very quickly moving developments, particularly things that were happening in terms of the public health orders and some shifting requirements there that were happening not by action of Board of Supervisors or other legislative body, but by specific officials appointed by statute with that authority. And so the state put that in to try and allow the elected officials to remain up to speed with some of the very quickly changing requirements. It's still allowed under the executive orders. I think it's become a little bit less common in terms of a regular practice. And then just generally speaking, consequences of violating the Brown Act. The headline on this one is that there is potential criminal liability for intentional violation of the act. It's pretty rare. You have to show a specific intent to have deprived the public of information. In my experience, the vast majority of Brown Act violations are, I would say, unintentional or accidental. Either you had a typo in the address on the agenda item, or you wandered off topic while you were discussing one item to start to get into an area that was a little bit too loosely connected to what had actually been on the agenda, or other sorts of issues along those lines. In those situations, the primary remedy is what's called a cure and correct. That is, a member of the public can submit a demand to the legislative body that they redo the item in public and allow the public an opportunity to hear and respond to the item. And then if the agency does that, then it's immune to further litigation in response to that item. The court can go ahead and order injunctive relief, can compel an agency to audio record its closed sessions if there's a credible allegation of violations of closed sessions. So the court can then conduct an in-camera review of the audio to determine whether or not it was appropriate under the Brown Act. And then the court can also award attorneys' fees and costs if there is an action to go ahead and enforce the Brown Act. And then we've got a number of resources here. These two are particularly good. So this is the League of Cities guide. Oh, and I think we also have one. We should have a link. Oh, maybe it got left off. The Attorney General also has a guide that, while old, is quite good in terms of the quality of its discussion Brown Act and Brown Act issues. You know, a lot of this is created by statute and then has been the result of Attorney General's opinions over the years that have helped sort of flesh out requirements and in particular help understand how they apply in a digital age. So I know that I've talked for several hours now, and we've covered a fair amount of ground. Any questions that anyone has on any of this?
Yeah, through the chair, I'd like to say that there's been no public comments received through the website at this time regarding your presentations.
And I did have a question, and I'm just curious if you see anything in the crystal ball regarding how long the COVID-19 virtual meetings might go on.
You know, I don't. I will say I've heard a lot of speculation about whether there will be change after the COVID emergency to allow easier virtual meetings going forward. There have been, you know, there's been talk of possible legislative changes. There have been some agencies that have just really liked the virtual meeting format and have felt that they've actually gotten better public participation. So, you know, there's speculation, but I don't have anything that I'd really sort of put money on at this point.
Thank you.
And if I make Chair Purnell, I saw that Commissioner Pollan had his hand up as well.
You answered my question as well. I was trying to peer into the future and just trying to understand if and how our participation virtually might be allowed in the future once in-person meetings are happening again. And it sounds like absent any changes to the legislative rules, if we were to participate remotely, we would have to be in a location that could be accessible to the public, and we would have to notice where that location is. And am I understanding that notice requirement is the same as the agenda notice posting requirement?
Correct. Yeah. I will say, so just anecdotally, when I was right out of law school, I applied to a law firm that listed among special skills that desired the ability to predict the future. I informed them that I predicted the future all the time, but my accuracy rate was not especially high. You know, I don't. You know, I can take guesses as to where this is going to go. I don't know that I have a strong sense as to what is particularly likely to happen at this point. We're in a very uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
Is there any lobbying being done by anyone to keep any of these COVID-19 rules in place beyond the pandemic that you know of?
You know, I haven't been following closely. I've certainly heard some discussion and some interest in it, and so it's possible that there has been some proposed changes, but I haven't been following that too closely. Any other questions?
I just have a comment. It would be super nice if we could do activities like this that have limited public interest, at least once COVID is over, by Zoom.
Yeah, and conceptually, under the statute, when we're out of COVID, you could all participate virtually if you all opened up your homes to the public and all had homes that were ADA accessible. On the other hand, you know, as a practical matter, I don't know how viable that really is. So, you know, I think that shows the limitations in terms of them having gone from, you know, a vague idea that they wanted to start facilitating, you know, telecommunication to now that we're actually living it in a COVID world, we see that maybe the rule as it existed wasn't. Was maybe a little bit more restrictive than it needed to be.
I have a follow-up question on that then. I manage Jug Handle Creek Farm, and we have a completely ADA accessible classroom space that also has Wi-Fi. Maybe in the post-COVID world, I love that phrase, post-COVID. maybe the coastal planning commissioners could join from that facility for some of the meetings just to reduce the burden of travel costs and time for us. I don't know if that's possible, but just an idea.
And just to respond to the chair, legally that's definitely possible. I would look to planning staff to see sort of how viable they see it logistically, but there may be some benefits to that. And frankly, if that's open to the public on the coast as well, which it would have to be, you might also be improving public participation by not requiring people to drive all the way inland.
And through the chair, this is Nash Gonzalez. And so the issue has come up as we start moving out of the COVID world and possibly into the reopening world. And so many of these topics tend to come up. So we'll be exploring that, not something that's going to happen immediately, but again, because of a lot of the issues associated with opening up facilities to the general public and so on. And typically when we do have meetings off site, we usually have to secure the facilities and so on. So there is protocol through that. So stay tuned. I'll see what I can find. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Christian Curtis, Matt Kudrowski for the presentations this morning. For me, it was also a review of ethics training and Brown Act, which I took, I want to say about a year ago. So a lot of it is very familiar, but you guys did a wonderful job. Thank you. And if you have any other presentations or courses, we'd be interested to bring back to the Planning Commission as well.
Yes, thank you, County Council and Deputy County Council. Did you have any closing remarks for us today?
No, just, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I know that we're going over some terrain that's a little bit familiar since we did this with some of you a while ago, but we do have significant turnover. We want to make sure that we're covering it for everyone. And I will also just say that, this agency this commission probably deals with a lot more of some of the advanced concepts on the conflict side than a lot of the other bodies that I'm dealing with. So, please feel free to ask questions. And if there are areas, that it would help for us to do sort of any additional training or provide additional information, we're happy to do so. One thing that was, brought up a little bit previously was, in terms of planning concepts, legal limitations, police power, and, the use of zoning laws, spot zoning, those sorts of things. We could probably put something together. We'd need a little bit of time to do so, but we could do something, put something together that would hopefully be able to give you a little bit of framework for understanding some of both the legal framework for the use of the zoning powers, but also some of the limitations from constitutional or state law perspective.
Great, thank you. And I just have to say, just as a compliment and also for the benefit of the newer commissioners, I have found County Council office to be very responsive to any questions that I have about potential conflicts of interest. And they've, walked me through decision-making processes, of course, never formally advising, but just helping me think through things. There's a lot of information that was presented today, and each time I hear this presentation, I think a new layer sinks in. So I just want to thank you for today's presentation and also being on tap for us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Glad to help.
And with that, we will be moving on to our next agenda item, matters from staff. Do you have anything for us?
Through the chair, this is Nash Gonzalez. No matters from staff.
Okay, any matters from the commission? Okay, seeing none, we are moving on to agenda item 9, approval of the meeting minutes. And we are starting with February 18th, 2021. And just as a reminder, on these meeting minutes, you do not have to have been present at the meeting in order to vote on the minutes. The only change that I saw is just a simple typo. It is the last word on the first page. Ordinance is misspelled. But I didn't see anything else that needed edits. Any other commissioners have any comments on the February 18th minutes? Okay, seeing none, I think we're ready for a motion.
I'll move that we approve the minutes of February 18th as amended.
Thank you, Commissioner Pollan. And do we have a second?
I'll second.
Very good. First and a second.
Roll call vote. Commissioner Wiedemann,
Yes.
Commissioner Pollan,
Yes.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner Morris,
I'll abstain this time.
and Chair Purnell.
Yes. Okay, moving on to meeting minutes from March 4th. Any comments or
There is an amendment on the front page. We did have Department of Transportation was present, and I did not put them on the other departments. So I did list them as Alexander Sequeira, Department of Transportation. That's the correction I have.
Great, thank you for that. Anything else? Okay, looking for a motion.
I'll move that
I
we
make-
adopt the minutes.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Diana. I'll
To you.
move that we adopt the meeting minutes of March, what was the date, 4th?
Yes, March 4th.
With the revised as mentioned in this meeting.
I'll second.
Commissioner Wiedemann,
Yes.
Commissioner Jones,
Yes.
Commissioner Pollan,
Yes.
Commissioner Morris,
I'll abstain.
Chair Purnell.
Yes,
Thank you. Motion passes.
thank you. And now we're just looking for a motion to adjourn.
I'll move that we adjourn the meeting.
I'll second it.
And I don't believe we need a roll call vote on that. So thank you, everybody, and see you at our next meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.